Very excited to be here today with Tobi. Tobi is the co-founder and CEO of Shopify. Born in Germany, a developer since he was 12 years old. Tobi, you dropped out of high school when you were 16 to become a professional developer. And then in 2004, launched Snow Devil, which was an online snowboard store. 2 years later, you realized the online store part was probably more valuable than the snowboards, and launched Shopify when you were 25 years old. And today, Shopify serves millions of merchants around the world, does 4 or 5 billion in annual revenue, and employs about 15,000 employees. So Tobi, you are also famously a gamer. And so I wanted to ask you, if I want to be a better CEO, which video games should I play?
Oh boy! If you're preparing for a career as a CEO, then there's a lot of options. If you are currently CEO, then you have to find something that fits into very small increments of time. So I don't know. I reference strategy games. I mean, look, what video games allow you to do is most good video games are some kind of a simulation, and they allow you to modify the simulation and see you get a sense for how everything reacts to the choices you make. I think it's a fantastic way to spend your teens because I think it gives a certain sense of agency. Like I spent a lot of time playing StarCraft and the various predecessors of that, and I always thought it was like. And looking back at this, I certainly learned a lot of things from these games. Just even like treating attention as a resource, right? Like it's, StarCraft specifically is one of those games where you're trying to zap the opponent of ability to do a good job of everything they want to do. You sort of mess with their plan a little bit to get a little bit of an edge. And in the end, both sides had exactly the same opportunity, but there's one winner, and then you do it again and sort of get feedback real time on your progress. And I think that's a really, really good thing. There's a lot of video games that work like this.
There's even a video game that I think you've offered to buy for all Shopify employees who want to play it. Tell us what that game is.
Factorio. Factorio is one of those indie success story games. I think it's a very small team that's built it somewhere in Eastern Europe, and if I'm not mistaken. But people say it's sort of like a job, but basically it's like this fascinating thing where you start like manually doing a bunch of tasks, and then you create this automation. And throughout the course of a game, like you start by mining coal with a pickaxe and gather resources. Eventually, you launch a rocket back to space, and between that, you build something that like a factory that's so intricate and so complicated that you could never. There's no chance to like plan this on a spreadsheet and just build it in one go. It just sort of organically grows, and you learn to live with mistakes and kind of adjust. The reason why this is actually a line item in the expense system in Shopify. Everyone gets to expense this game because while it's extremely fun, it actually really gives you a very intuitive sense for what operational excellence looks like. What people tend to end up with a full theoretical framework for queuing theory. And, these are hard to come by topics, which you can pick up very intuitively by osmosis in video games. So we're pretty pro video games. And it's also just a fun topic.
I spent a couple hours, when I heard about your recommendation to Factorio, I actually went and got the game.
Oh, yeah?
And I spent a few hours playing. And
you're one of the very few people then who managed to only play a few hours.
Yeah, I play well. Yeah, it may have been recently, so there may be more in my future. But it definitely is like if Tim Cook made a video game about supply chains and operational efficiency, it would be Factorio. Now, I think you also may be one of the only people in the world who met your wife through video games. Is that true too?
I certainly don't. I mean, maybe one of the earliest people.
Maybe one of the first.
So initially, we actually were sort of coy about this because it sounded like really, really weird, right? And video games are again an activity. This was an online game called Ashen's Call. It's sort of like World of Warcraft before World of Warcraft was released. We were friends. We played together. We had some adventures. She lived in North America. I lived in Europe, although I was basically living in EST time zone because I'm sort of a night owl. So we ended up playing together. It's like sort of like meeting your partner at I guess a tennis club, like doing any other hobby. So it's certainly like now it's actually funnily it's like the people who meet not online and some kind of
they become the minority.
Yes, a minority now. It's just, and I have this really strange experience that so much of what becomes relevant to me in my life later ends up being things that were almost telegraphed early in life, or whatever was like. Just even from growing up, going to comic stores, reading Avengers and Lord of the Rings, and that was a very nerdy thing to do. Going then to computers and programming was a very nerdy thing to do. And sort of the world seems to always conspire to just make mainstream roughly what we did as nerds 10, 20 years ago. And that's certainly been like just really, really fun.
And you have a gaming family now too. You play with your kids.
Yeah, I have 3 kids. My 3 boys. My sister accuses me of not actually having started a family, but rather a Dota team. So it's especially during the pandemic, it was kind of hard for there to be like good activities. So like just starting to play things together when we couldn't go outside, or actually getting them to play with their friends, and it was end up working really well. So we encourage that kind of thing.
Kind of an episode of Ender's Game at Tobi's house. So Shopify serves millions of merchants, and this gives you obviously like a pretty unique perspective on what's happening in the world of e-commerce. And I think we saw over the last couple of years this, at least in the US, this acceleration of e-commerce. It went up, I don't know, from 17 or 18% penetration to maybe 20 or 21%. In contrast to countries like South Korea, which I think has maybe 40% e-commerce penetration. So I think the question a lot of people are wondering is, what's happening now and kind of where are we going? Are we becoming South Korea? Did we catch up to some extent? Are we going to continue doing that? What do you see from your point of view?
Yeah, this was a big debate, and during this time, one thing which happened for sure is like right when the pandemic started. Digital online stores played a huge role, right? Like we took out all the stops. We launched everything, like basically every feature that could be useful at the beginning of a pandemic to help, especially the local businesses that lost. It's a weird way to think about a street, but street is not terribly different from a fiber optic cable connecting you to the world of commerce, right? Like it's once people are not allowed to use streets anymore, then the businesses aren't connected, and therefore they will go out of business very, very quickly. So there was a wonderful grassroots, in some cases, effort by the more technical-minded people to get their favorite stores online, and just so that people could, continue and keeping them in business, like shipping, click to buy, and all these things, and curbside delivery was what we did. It did a bunch of things at the same time. One thing is like, again, when the world of retail, like going into physical stores is disabled, then everything has to shift somewhere. Like some switches don't happen, but largely they still happen. And so, that happened, like that accelerated things. And then stimulus checks happened, and that accelerated things. Fundamentally, people ended up spending more money on goods rather than experiences, partly because, again, we didn't have experiences to finance it during those times. And so it accelerated a lot. And the question was, is this like a durable jump forwards on this sort of progressive, like meandering towards some kind of equilibrium? I think, a lot of it has now shifted back into the different channels as the different channels are available again. But what it also did is like every business in the world has a functioning understanding about how to be in multiple channels. Every person in the world has some functioning understanding about how to work for a company, or at least how to connect with people through devices. And so we see a lot, like people are asking a lot more from software. I think this will always be determined largely by buyers' behavior. Like I think every business is assumed to be available wherever people are and however people discover products. And I think this is something that Shopify does really, really well. So we fit well into this world. I expected us to do more of a jump forward. I'm a little bit surprised that it's reverted to, you can almost trend line through this, and we are basically exactly on track, a little bit ahead, but not much more. I wonder though if it could be that the slope of a curve now accelerates, just as people kind of figure out how to take best advantage of the different things that they can do.
Why do you think? What's your explanation for why our equilibrium currently is in sort of the low 20%, and then you do have countries like Korea that are at what is sort of the phenomenological difference or the qualitative difference between a country or a buyer's market that's at 40% equilibrium versus 21 or 22%?
And then China is in there too. Hard to get the numbers, and frankly, the numbers tend to be somewhat difficult to compare. Partly, like there's always like which category are tickets for venues in, and what is actually all counted in these things differs a little bit, and methodology differs a little bit. I think very often it just depends on how good the thing was. Like at the beginning of digitalization, like at which point did it become as good or better than what was there, right? And the United States had an incredibly sophisticated retail culture, like car-based culture, malls there, which are places that are treated as not just place to purchase, they are gathering centers in many ways, right? Like so. I think like the retail plays different cultural roles in different places, and so I think different countries end up in different equilibria. What's interesting though, like for instance, the UK is not really a place that you would imagine, but there was a more durable jump forward, right? Like to digitalization. So actually, frankly, even like I spend a lot of time with space, and I love this space. I love numbers. If you would have asked me told me what was about to happen and how it shakes out, I would have had a lot of trouble predicting. I think these things are often random walks a little bit, and we always try to have this sort of one true answer that implies some kind of causality, but in reality, it's like there's a lot of preference, a lot of path dependence, and a lot of inertia in the system. So we'll see. But certain is. It used to be that a retailer started, and at some point, year 5 or something, year 6, after growth in initial channel, if they had a board of directors, the board of directors would sit down and say, like, maybe let's make a decision to go into one more channel, right? Like it's like let's also do wholesale or also do online or something like this. That's certainly over. Like I mean, this was an inefficiency which got optimized away by just software not making like these industries out of these. Vertical slices of the channels that the same software really needs to address, and I think that's going to play a little bit like actually a rather big role, because it will invite a lot more experimentation by retailers, and that's going to be a lasting thing.
So now, if I were to look across kind of the millions, there's the buyer side of this, which is what do the buyers prefer, what do they want to do, and we're observing that writ large in the form of this e-commerce penetration curve. But then there's also the question of what do the merchants want to do, and the merchants generally want to grow, they want to succeed,
yes.
They want to reach more customers. And so if I were to just pick at random a Shopify merchant and ask them, what is the binding constraint on the growth of your business? What would it be? Would it be capital? Would it be management talent? Would it be distribution or fulfillment, or what would that be for most of your customers?
I think it's friction writ large. It's very notable when you talk to the merchants, even the ones that are growing quite quickly, is that they very quickly go to quality of life issues, right? Like around retail. There's clearly some parts which they love, and I think this is one of the big changes now. This sort of episode of a retail history, so to speak. We are coming off the century, maybe a little bit less, where all of retail was dominated by the channels because distribution was the thing that everyone had to solve for. And outside of some things like the CS catalog, there really was no go direct like opportunities, or only in very marginal. So like the products end up being shaped much more by the distribution channel than by actually the ingenuity of entrepreneurs behind them, because it's a merchandiser who either buy or not buy, and they really need to make a certain amount of profit, and it needs to fit in a certain amount of compact thing, and it needs to the packaging needs to be extremely colorful because otherwise it's drowned out by everything else colorful around it, and I think that's caused a huge regression in quality of products that people who make products are really unhappy with. So one thing we've seen what the internet, you and I are both products of sort of a very idealistic internet of the 90s, where the most amazing thing when internet came to town was like just this sort of participatory nature. Like you could go on IRC and it was like type your first thing. It was literally the first time there was any chance for anything I did as a person to be observed with low latency by people who are not kind of in my vicinity. The only thing I could come up with that similarly would do this is like calling into some like television show, but I've since found out was probably all fake anyway. So it's like so there really wasn't this, and that was a new thing. Like when something new becomes possible.
I remember, by the way, in the 90s, my first time on IRC in a channel with 100 people. It was a Linux channel, saying something and having stage fright. Like actually realizing, like, oh, it was like one of the first times I've ever spoken to 100 plus people at the same time as a teenager.
Yeah, and I think it was especially because we knew the world, like everyone around us understood the world as it was. Yes. And the moment you participate, or even just know that you could type something, you realize you know something about the world that most people don't have in their model. So this sort of created a sense of idealism about like this participatory nature of the internet, which I think carried forward by the people who went through their formative years in this time. And Shopify is wonderful in this way. I think it's at least my best stab at an implementation of this particular ideal of building something that then many people without the technical know-how can use to participate on internet, like kind of gain some kind of sovereignty over their the thing they are building, which you don't get when you're selling through channels. It depends on how good your relationships are with the channels. Eventually, you can potentially get it, but you need some leverage to show up for these negotiations. So, what direct to consumer, as it's called now, has done is that people could actually build products that then directly went to consumers who knew exactly where it came from, exactly where the feedback needed to go, and said exactly how this could become better. And then the feedback loop became this sort of virtuous cycle of improving the products in a way that just was missing. And I find that whenever something isn't that thing that people have to do, they treat it as a distraction. And different people have different tolerance for dealing with friction and distraction and sort of side quests to the main quest. But like you really quickly get into all the topics you talk about, which are like capital of course is a big limiter, but also like distribution. The internet has conspired to really make distribution generally available, but now increasingly quality distribution people would like to know that the thing is going to arrive tomorrow or 2 days from now, and then you need to not fail to do that, right? And so that's something that isn't perfectly democratized yet. Building that, unfortunately, is a project that takes often 2-3 years of flying around and negotiating with a lot of different 3PLs in different places, and it causes this level of complexity for retailers that is often something they just nope out and keep their business intentionally small because they can't build it on their own terms to the size to the next step of size, and it's really ambition. I think that people want, like, some people are just like plain ambitious and just saying, okay, I'm going to go for, like, I'm going to be the next Nike. But even there, it's like on their own terms. And so this concept of sovereignty and own decision-making power is important. And frankly, the internet has not yielded a lot of ownable territory, right? Like, it's basically like the domain name, your own website, if you get rights to the HTML, which you do with Shopify. And maybe your mailing list are the things that you can own, and that's basically the set. Everything else is rented. at least in our space. And so I think that matters to them.
So it does seem to me like Shopify is very much a kind of 90s idealistic, or at least rooted in the values of the early internet, which is that it's this decentralizing force. It levels the playing field, and it allows you to connect directly to your audience in all these important ways. And so your focus, I guess, and the way you think about it when you say arming the rebels is to allow a merchant to be able to spend the maximum amount of their time possible thinking about their product and their customers, and as little time as possible working on everything else.
Right, and I think this is, I love for software to conspire to allow people to just focus on their thing instead of all the other stuff that you need to do. Like there's so much toil in the world, which just is not productive. And I'm not even coming at this from a GDP perspective or from an economics perspective or even from a growth perspective. It just seems like the right thing to do. What do we want computers to do on this planet? Kind of remove the toil, right? Just make this whole thing more fun. Allow people to self-express themselves. And again, Shopify is not one of those companies which is set out to change the world in any meaningful way, because it's just wouldn't it be cool if Shopify existed? Frankly, when I looked at my snowboard store, I was dismayed that Shopify didn't exist. I had my snowboards, I did all the research, I had them in a garage at this point, and I just wanted to kind of I had supply, which I knew there was demand for, and we reduce these issues to supply and demand and pretend that there's not friction in creating the supply or friction in for the demand to actually learn about the demand for the thing. And then this huge amount of friction between those two things finding each other, right? And so I find friction governs the world much, much more than policy, laws, or basically any other force. And so I think one of the best things that software can deliver is kind of create this place where it meets people at their perfect skill set with a perfect amount of, with the ideal amount of, trying to just have in our case, entrepreneur just say, here's the products as they exist, as I'm thinking about it. Here's everything I know about it. Here's why I'm excited about it. And then the systems start you out with, okay, here is your idealized website that has things like Shop Pay, and you can just go everyone who's ever done anything with Shop Pay can just instantly buy it, and there's no friction for them. But as you are building your business and going in more channels, you can do the same thing to the best degree possible with all Instagram or retail and all these things. Just that toil was not something that board of directors had to make a decision, and then there's an 8-month implementation plan. That really just was what engineers needed to write code for. And I think that's trying to get closer and closer to this ideal is just sort of what we do around the office.
So this is an interesting thing, this idea of this ideal. So one of the themes I've heard from you a lot over the years when you talk about Shopify, and just in general about building companies and products, is that you shouldn't compare yourself to your competitors. You should compare yourself to what could exist. What is the ideal product? And I found this quote from you in 2018 where you said, the perfect e-commerce software is one where you put in your name, you put in your product, sales just appear, and then the product is teleported to the customer in seconds. So I thought that was it's an inspiring vision. I would love that too. Some of that Shopify already does.
Yeah.
There's a couple, you're gesturing at a couple maybe newish areas there. I think we'll leave the teleporter aside for a second. But sales that just sort of magically appear is a really interesting topic, especially right now, last 6 months, ATT, IDFA, some of the tools that merchants use to make sales appear in the past are maybe less effective or have been limited to some extent. You have Shopify Audiences, which you introduced, relatively recently. And, this is an important area for merchants, this advertising spend. It's one of the largest, I guess, expense areas for merchants that you don't directly participate in as much. Is making sales magically appear part of Shopify's future?
I mean, if it's possible, yes. To a degree it's possible, we'll especially now with Audiences, we have sort of started charting a path where we take a more active role in this. But I see this as one arrow in the quiver for entrepreneurs. I think it's such a big part of building the business is finding the right audience for it. It's I always go back to Kevin Kelly's essay of 1,000 true fans and what the internet. I think he wrote it roughly the time when I started with Shopify, and it just like made a really, really big impression on me. And so the Google advertising platform and then specifically Facebook were just incredibly underappreciated. And one thing you see, and something of incredible value exists in the world, is like it's very rare that anyone just jumps in and just like says, okay, this is what like is a positive ROI, and let's go there immediately and just buy all inventory. Like it's actually a very small, like it's a meandering towards the value, which actually took surprisingly long. We probably had all the data we needed to know in 2008 to understand that it's actually perfectly profitable to pay today's cost per acquisition prices for sneakers. But no one kind of allowed themselves to just jump there immediately. Like when I started, I paid like 40 cents per conversion for my snowboard sales because I advertised as only advertiser on the keywords for ski resorts, and that was like a very, very different time from today. So anyway, like again, what makes entrepreneurship so fun, and this is why like when I say like focus on your a product, like what I should say is like product market fit, right? And the reason why that's such an interesting thing is like the market changes constantly. Like it's actually an infinite game itself, because at some point like certain advertising channels were extremely cheap, and then afterwards they became potentially too expensive, and some people allocated a lot of traditional brand advertising into them without having the sophistication of having like really tracking the return on investment. And so everything the entrepreneurs had to, who cannot deal with waste, had to shift into other channels, had to find other things. Influencer marketing has been a big thing, but actually just community building. Like we are now at a point where, especially with the quality of products, like the quality of the products you get through direct to consumer is just so vastly higher than anything you could get previously through the more channel induced quality levels. And so the best business model is actually one which is almost a little bit like old school. It's like customer lifetime value. It's like it's actually have a relationship with people, like build a trust battery in our parlance. And so so this is all like the good businesses really, really create these communities and then figuring out how to go from there. But the problem is, of course, with all this is I really care about new entrepreneurs, and we have some businesses which are unbelievably large. We once upon a time, this was a couple of years ago, we actually raised one of our customers who got to $1 billion of revenue first, which is like wow. One of the coolest experiences you can ever have. So we love what we've enabled like on the platform, and we'd see all of this as attestation that the whole thing we're building is important. But like bringing this to maybe the rebels, if you want to call it that, but like bringing this to the people who are just starting out. Like here's a stack of things that is scalable and allows you to focus and allows you to go find your market and your fit. It's just what we want to bring it to as many people as possible. So, sorry, I like trying to land this airplane back to audiences. Like, yeah, so audiences is concretely something we are doing. We have a specific position here that we can backfill something that was thought to potentially be somewhat lost with finding, just the right customers for these products, like specifically products that are at the intersection of a couple of interests, right? Because maybe one moment on this, some of the changes that have happened now, like GDPR and ATT, they're all good changes. They are, I think, fixing some problems that just emerged from the way we build these technological platforms in more naive times, I think. But like it's always important to think about the secondary effects, right? Like GDPR is like a really good set of legislations, but it has the particular annoying parts around the cookie banners, which are just like such a own goal in so many ways, right? Like it would have been so easy to ask for browser vendors to just figure this out once and then like let's go. instead, we ask every business to do, which means that the first time you do a Google search, Google says, hey, 1 second, can you just give us consent here once? And then you never are going to ask again by anything that Google ever launches. But every single corner store will always have to put like a banner in front of you, which is going to cause friction, which might lose your interest of wanting to transact with them might already be lowered. And that sucks. That's the kind of friction which really, really shapes the economies of the future, right? And then ATT making it harder, like one of the side effects of it is simply that it's harder to find people who are at the intersection of a bunch of different interests. The way this reflects is the auctions become more expensive, right? Like, so they might have gotten 5% more expensive. It's really just, it's something almost everyone can deal with, although averages are misleading because it really means that Procter & Gamble had no increase because they just broadcast advertise anyway, because they sell toothpaste. And then, but if you make, Pokemon-inspired electric skateboards, not a real thing, but like if that's what you would be doing, finding the people who have these interests is the only way to get to this 1,000 true fans, which you require to bootstrap this business. And this business will simply never exist if you can't do this.
Smallest merchants seeking that first group of super fans are the ones who are maybe affected most.
Yeah, exactly. Massively. Because for them, it's like 40% more expensive. On top of, by the way, you then paying more for shipping costs because they don't have bargaining power with the carriers. On top of them, potentially not being able to, like if they can deliver, it's like going to be a delivery that's going to take a week to very important places, which is going to lead to lower reviews, which then discourages other people to purchase. Like world's already stacked against new enterprises in enough ways. And so what Shopify really, like, this is what we spend all our time with, and like, what can we make go away here? Like, what are the things we can backfill? What are the things we can improve? These new entrants, the entrepreneurs, they're not the people we make the most money off, right? This is like, they need a lot of customer support. They have a lot of questions about how to set up a business. They have a lot of questions about, like if you ever make a spreadsheet, they are not the target audience for a business like ours. But the mission requires us to do it. It's like this, and this is where I think things get interesting around mission-driven companies. What we've proven out is just like I think every capital allocator VC finds out, is like it's very hard to predict future success stories. So it turns out if you help a lot of people find their start and their 1,000 true fans, some of them become the ones you might raise $4 billion of revenue at some point, and that's really, really so the business model actually works out perfectly, but that's super unobvious initially, and we're just basically lucky that it works out so well.
But there's no orthodoxy or sort of limits from your point of view. If Shopify would use its sort of aggregate buying power to help merchants reach audiences, that's within the bounds of something you'd consider doing.
Oh yeah. If we can do a really, really good job there, that works for our different stakeholders. I mean, people are looking to us to not kingmake on the platform, right? Like that's an important thing. We want to be, we don't want to compromise our relationship we have with our customers. Like Shopify has this unbelievably wonderful situation where we are on, like, there's no adversarial relationship with really anyone in the ecosystem. We're on the same side of a table as our customers, because like our business model is basically just them becoming successful. That works perfectly for us in all these different ways of how our business model works. So we can spend a lot of time doing this. And then we have the app ecosystem, which is also, like, again, same side of the table. They are building things which cause them to be more successful, and then they get to be successful, and theme designers and so on. I mean, I don't want to say sometimes you don't have conversations with them, but a bit like, hey, can you do more of that thing, like, or less of this thing? Like, sometimes in every relationship there's couples counseling requirement, but like it's fundamentally we are not trying to do any situation, like nothing resembling your margin is my opportunity enters the sort of long-term arc of the company, and I think that's.
Yeah, Shopify is creating net new merchants, or helping assist in the growth and creation of net new merchants, and so your contribution is positive. So, okay, so now we can get to the teleporter. The other piece of that quote was about getting the product to the customer, and this is something you've traditionally, I think, leaned on. And you mentioned 3PLs earlier, but you've leaned on your ecosystem and your platform for. But increasingly now, Shopify is investing in fulfillment. there's a lot of areas where Shopify has made, I think, big and long-term investments that have just accrued value to merchants and removed friction like you've talked about. This one I think is unusual and seems like a big shift, to a lot of people because it is a big investment and it seems like such a challenging thing to do, logistics, fulfillment, assets, et cetera. How do you think about this fulfillment investment and where's that going over the next few years?
Honestly, the initial brief for that really started with a teleporter. It's like ideally we can just teleport atoms to people's front door or desk. Can't quite figure out the physics or behind there. So what is the second best thing or third best thing we can do given the realities of what we can build? And so as I say, I find that there's a lot of industries that are just oddly sliced, where people kind of created had early opinions about just what is which part of industry and where the handovers from one place to another, and everyone has to protect their margins in these kind of things instead of just sort of working backwards from problems. There's a famous book, or the shipping container was a famous solve for slicing through all these different, the trucking companies being independent from no one really, seemingly, at least as the story went, truly cared about moving freight around or accomplishing the goal of bringing products to a final place. People cared a lot about trucks and a lot of trains, a lot about boxcars and a lot about longshoremen and a lot about ships. And so slicing through this is often very, very important. And there's lots of places, and this is literally the place where this actually happens, not with enough frequency. This is reflected in terms of the complexity of just working with this world in logistics. Now, logistics is unbelievably complex. I don't want to belittle the challenge here in any which way, because I was recently in a conversation with the team around Shopify Fulfillment Network, which I'll get into. But if the anecdote is kind of useful, I feel like I'm almost globally uniquely situated to appreciate the size of a retail industry and appreciate the complexity of a logistics world. And in a conversation, I tried to get everyone to think bigger, and I said something to the degree of, I bet you the companies that supply the wooden pallets to the warehouses is like a $3 billion industry. So just trying to make the statement, this is all very big with a lot of opportunity. And then someone actually looked it up during the meeting and mentioned that it is a $65 billion industry, right? And so, I haven't independently verified it, but that's so. To the best of my knowledge, I have a tangible proof that, I, given my privileged position, looking at all this, have underestimated the size of a component in this industry by 20x, and that's just really, really notable. And I think that happens all the time. And the other thing that everyone underestimates is the internet size, by the way. So these retail and internet both conspire to be very big. And so then merchants have to build out logistics to be able to be competitive in a world of expectations really revolving around next day or 2-day delivery for the non-essential products, aka the products people actually really want rather than the products they need. If it's something you need, you should try to get it to people ideally same day or in a couple of hours. If it's something people want, it's actually perfectly okay just to make a commitment about that's 1 or 2 nights and then nail it, ideally outperform it. So for the merchants, that's in somewhere in the growth arc for every merchant. They have to then go and again actually do work with warehouses and trucking companies and last mile deliverers and shipping companies, partly because this industry outside of a shipping container is still sliced in this way. Solving this is something that we can just do, partly because we can see things coming in on shore and from there going through all the sortation centers and we have broad overview of data and be able to co-locate things in third-party warehouses in close to population centers if you predict that there's going to be a sale in the next couple of days, which we are getting pretty good at. So there's huge opportunities to get closer to teleportation at least. the way we are implementing this, initially we try to do is fully on partner, which like just partnering in or working with existing infrastructure, just platform approach. That was silly, frankly. I'm looking back at this and was like, I just feel like I didn't quite bring the lessons that I already had from building Shopify. Like when you're building a platform, it has to be on a stable foundation, because otherwise, if you build on a shaky foundation, nothing you build on top ends up ever being stable, right? So at some point we had to tell everyone, hey, we figured out that absolutely for doing this, we have to build these larger warehouses that we have to own and run with our own warehouse management systems and robotics and so on, because that's what we will need to get to the unit economics that people expect and that's competitive for merchants. And then there's still going to be a lot of partner component, but this additional increase in capital expenditure was something we probably communicated fairly poorly, because it sounded like we made a big change, although what the change was really that of a tactic, and of course with a dramatic implication of how this looks like when you look at the change from a GAAP accounting perspective. So which doesn't factor maybe in our decision making as much as people might imagine. And someone might argue we should think a little bit more about it. And I think that's right, as long as it doesn't make us make bad choices, because at the end of the day, when you take a longer term perspective to company building, these are just columns and money moves around. If the thing that you're building is, again, ideal for the problem it's trying to solve, you'll do better than if you hyper-optimize for the way it's like avoiding capital expenditure.
Yeah, when you and I have talked about this or other topics, I'm always inspired by the way you always come back to what's the merchant experience and what is the ideal experience for them and how do we deliver that long term? And then you check it against what are the unit economics, and those have to work out, obviously, for you and for the merchants. And then the rest, I think, is lagging indicators or maybe in some cases leading indicators of the work necessary to get there. But long term, that's how you build the value.
Yeah. I mean, there are like these core components of everything that you build. In a lot of the digital world is like the architecture you build matters a lot. Like I mean, we talked about this. I'm fairly technical. I'm always, I have CEO in my title. So often, the strategy of a company is actually set by the architecture of the software. Like how many location retail software can we like for our retail product, point of sale product? How many locations can we support? Well, that's like I can make any decision I want and put it in a spreadsheet. It doesn't matter. Like it's like that was, whatever we optimized the software for, and that decision was made at some point time ago in a technical review that I may or may not have been part of. So you like sometimes you really have to know where the actual levers are of decision making, because in this world, in a technology world, it's almost universally architecture, software, and a product that are setting the headroom for strategic decision making. And then within the headroom created by these disciplines, a CEO can make tactical choices or strategic choices. In a world of like a physical world, it's very different. And there really it's our potential for the Shopify Fulfillment Network is really based on what is the like headroom of unit economics we can reach. And that really depends on your initial approach. And it's going to be extraordinarily hard later to unwind what you've built. Yeah. If you've built it on a foundation that made certain assumptions over here, and you realize it would have been better to build it on these foundations. So like you have to get this right. And this is this is definitely
true of website performance too. Like your website is not going to be more performant than your architecture allows it to be. And I think what you're saying is your unit economics will never exceed what your business architecture and to some extent your technical architecture enables.
That's exactly right. I think it's actually one of those case in points for like why these companies now are also really bizarrely complicated to build, because the multivariant equation, the amount of inputs you have to consider for making choices is just massive, right? And so you need a lot of discipline about this. This is, I think, why it's really important to be able to change your mind, not change your mind, but rather rerun the evaluation function over all the inputs that went into the evaluation function over and over again, because sometimes the inputs change. Like, I mean, again, at some point, there was a implicit input into every decision we ever made that was like, people can leave their house.
Right.
It's just like it's an invisible part of a state, basically, and passed as a pointer into every decision ever. And then no one paid a lot of attention, but suddenly that true went false during shelter-in-place times, and you had to rederive basically the entire like stack of functions that make decisions in your company to figure out what's actually good now.
So on to some current events. There's just been a lot of turmoil in the markets lately, you may have noticed. And so how do you think about kind of leading the team at Shopify through that? And how do you remain focused on what matters? And how do you help the team and deal with and interpret volatility?
Yeah, I mean, to the degree possible, right? Like it's, I mean, it's very, very hard when everyone's sort of getting messages from sometimes mom saying, hey, I heard you guys like in terrible shape. Because, you know, like, frankly, internally, we have our opportunity to like really put, like, companies are not their stock, right? Like it's the stock is, again, it's a market. We love markets. We help entrepreneurs launch into markets. Markets are someone's willing to buy, someone's willing to sell, and sometimes more people want to sell for current events, like, you know, Russia does something, whatever Russia does, and suddenly the stock market is very much changed. I don't think that means we got 10% dumber that day, right? Like, it's like it just was a current events, right? So, I mean, just this kind of talk helps internally. It's additionally hard just because we've, like, 13 years of a bull run is just like, so few people have a working memory or even had, like, their career hasn't started when the last time things got tough. So this is the first experience with this. So, you know, the trick is, like, let's talk a lot about it. You know, in our case, people, you know, I mean, Shopify is a company which always traded a lot about its future potential. And so if people think about the future potential of planet Earth to be like really, really, really good, then that multiplies with our future potential together to a very big number. And if people turn rather pessimistic and short-term focused, then suddenly that assumed value disappears. And so I think that this is sort of a swings we see. A lot of it is market beta. A lot of it is after like a run-up, like Shopify ends up being overweight in a lot of funds, and people rotate out of the funds and so on. So like it's you know, anyway, I'm sure I don't have to explain markets to anyone here, but I think the key is just like we should know what it is and what the thing is, but it can't be making decisions, right? Like it's we can't make decisions because of what the stock market is outside of things like fundraising, which is clearly, that really depends. Like where the input really is the price. And so it's been, like, we've done a lot of work during the run-up saying, hey, I don't think we became 50% smarter in the last couple months. So when it goes down, we shouldn't feel like we are half as smart. And I think it did help us. We did prepare people. And but yeah, like, there's always a lot of conversation. It's just the predominant societal narrative, especially media narrative, is everyone minds the Brownian motion of sort of a day-to-day movements for the maximum amount of of ink. And I know why everyone's doing this. I would probably do the same. There's supply and demand for both sides, and it's cheap to produce, so let's go. The way that reflects inside of companies sometimes is a little bit more annoying, and they'll figure it out.
Makes sense. Also recently, in fact, earlier this week, Shopify shareholders voted to issue you a special founder share of stock that gives you effectively much more control over the company. My question is, do you have it with you and can I see it?
Yeah, there's a joke internally that they want to mint it as an NFT.
Yeah.
Like, I cannot deal with the custody issues of that particular NFT.
But why is it important for companies to be founder-led? Should all companies be founder-led?
No, definitely not. I think it's I think there should be different types of companies, and it should be very clear which one is which. And it's like, for what it's worth, no one voted more power for me, by the way. Like, it's just, this is actually like, it's actually less power. Like, we had a multi-class voting structure, so which voted 51% of all the shares. So instead, but there was future events, which could mean like we could have made this last forever by just being like making choices around, frankly, M&A and so on, or like we just didn't. It came up too much. Like I really want to be on the same side of the table of like everyone making decisions based on what's the best for merchants, right? And I see my role as being like having delegate authority for making choices for the entire set of stakeholders. We're a Canadian company. Canada articles of incorporation require you to be a stakeholder company, not a like a multi-stakeholder company, not just shareholder value over everything company. This includes customers and employees and community and society. So I think that's actually a really good thing we sort of inherited from our country. Anyway, so B shares already voted 51%. We instead of having some arbitrary sunset that ends up being relevant in decision making about capital allocation, it's simply now it's going to be 40%, which so majority to minority vote, and it'll be around while the board employs me, and the board of directors felt it was a very important thing to preserve this, partly because we are pretty sure that a bunch of gentlemen agreements in the public markets are simply come away, and there's going to be more activism, frankly, which isn't even necessarily a bad thing, but like I know I wouldn't be able to deal with it. Like my like I would file to the bottom of every spreadsheet where people are looking at the skill sets you need to create broad consensus with sort of adversarial negotiations over company changes and contours. Like that just isn't. I wouldn't be effective. So I think it's better to actually say, look, this company has a mission. It's very stated. It has you can look at a founder letter, like from the IPO to what's the purpose of the whole thing and how they're making these decisions. And we've built this company in this way, and losing this would require us to be really something else. I think the one share, one vote kind situation is the ideal form for a company, but requires a management team that is extremely good at this kind of consensus decision making, creating long-term plans, holding everyone accountable to the plan, and that works really well in more mature spaces, but like in the more like the companies that resembles mission-led journeys into the unknown, sort of setting new contours for their industries. I think at least right this moment, there's a stable company system equilibrium around taking the founders who have a lot of context, not because they're better than people, but just because they have been there when every important decision was made, and therefore have they are representing a tradition themselves. And so prolonging that was important to the board, and it's something they did, and the shareholders agreed that this would be a good thing to do, so we did it. And I think it's an inspired choice. I'm not unbiased here, but like it feels like I don't know if Shopify could thrive if it has to become more of an institution, presumably at some point run by people who sort of inherit what we've built to this point, but then have to switch to more of a tailor risk, scientific management, OKR-based thing, rather than just working based on what's the ideal thing to do right this moment based on everything we know about merchants and markets and change and technology.
So maybe not every company should be founder-led in this way, but companies that are at the frontier, pushing the frontier, operating in areas of invention and ambiguity, pursuing a long-term mission, benefit from a founder who has this kind of ability to make decisions.
And I'm not even sure it's the only thing that works even in most spaces, but it's something that it's been working for us, and with Shopify, and frankly, it's the only thing I could lead. Right? Like I'm almost seeing this sort of protection from distraction, Like this is really just a firewall. Like I'm almost feeling like companies that don't have some kind of multi-voting shares or poison pills or something, they're like, that's like running your software company with all of your servers IP routable on the internet. It's like, well, you should have a firewall somewhere. Like it makes sense. Like you just simplify. Like technically you shouldn't need the firewall, because the firewall isn't like people can potentially bypass a firewall, but at least it simplifies the challenge, because you have multiple layers of there's defense in depth there. So But I think it acts as this. So I was a custodian of this before as the CEO. Like I'm custodian of this kind of set of defenses then. So nothing really changes, and in fact, power is actually reduced. And frankly, one thing we also optimize away, which I'm pretty like. I love my kids; they're fantastic. I just don't think they should inherit like voting control of a company. I think the multi-generational component of these B shares is really unideal and shouldn't be something that. It's mostly a thing that happens in the media industry, I guess.
Famously, the New York Times.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it can work in some places as well. I feel that's a roll of a dice every time the transfer happens, and I don't think tech should emulate that. I think this non-dilutive F share, founder share thing that's like is very clear disclaimer saying this is the way this particular company thinks about being run is a very good signal to the investors about the belief system, and it's very above board. Like everyone knows what they're buying into, and in our case, everyone who bought shares in Shopify bought into the structure, so it's like not a difference really.
You mentioned that technically, I guess in terms of your charter and the entity type, that Shopify is a Canadian company, but you're from Germany. And so in what ways is Shopify a German company?
Shopify is a cultural mongrel. It's started by Germans in Canada for Americans, basically. So it's very funny in this way. I don't know. I think multiculturalism is really underrated as a thing in companies. Canada has run one of the most long-term and successful experiments in broad multiculturalism, which is really was very inspiring to me after I moved to Canada. But the question is more about Germany. Well, I think the sort of minimum level of acceptable quality is higher and is much more reflected in the market, internal market. Like your products just don't succeed if they're low quality. I think that's a bit of it. The thing I think is another thing that we inherited is that dual education system is still underexposed and underrated. It's such a brilliant system. We just really need it everywhere else. We need to find paths to
the separate vocational path.
Yeah, like it's and the killer feature about it is the parent compatibility of it, which is super hard to replicate. I tried really hard and only I wasn't that successful with it here in Canada. It's just it was just perfectly okay. I'm technically a high school dropout, but I actually apprenticed it's just not recognized as a degree. I apprenticed as a computer programmer. And it wasn't computer science. It was actually we call it informatics, but basically just craft of making software. And that feels right? I think of myself much more as a craftsperson. I want to do the thing with what I got. I don't want to, there's a pragmatism in the crafts. And so we actually built a dev degree program. We work with universities. We have a bunch of students who are partly working for a company and partly getting their degrees. They get credits with it. They graduate without student loans, which is awesome. And in fact, Waterloo in Canada is actually almost a midpoint between the vocational system and sciences because they do so much co-op. So I think things are coming, but this is really something. So as it reflects in culture, I think it's cool because what I didn't detect when I left Germany, but maybe that's different now, 20 years later, is sort of this ambient optimism about the future. And I think that's very needed for building tech companies. If you don't think tomorrow is going to be better than today, it's very hard to imagine that you're going to spend all these hours building something for the future. We ended up with this neat combination of the sort of appreciation for craft, which reflected for us in terms of design, UX, and also just software and architecture. And then this optimism and incredible loyalty and hard work that comes from sort of a Canadian culture that we were exposed to, and the competitiveness because our customers were like in the dynamism of American economy, and everyone's kind of looking for new solution and little edges. And otherwise, why would you adopt some? I mean, we ask people something pretty crazy, right? We ask them to run your retail business predominantly off this thing that a bunch of like Yahoo's up in Canada built, right? Like it's like we asked people to trust us with their livelihoods, and but the fact that people did is a constant source of amazement to me, and I think that's cool. I don't think that would have worked anywhere else. So there's a bit of everything in there.
Yeah. All right, well, Tobi, thank you very much.
This was really fun. It was
really
a great
fun
conversation.
Yeah.
I don't know if I really don't know if it was interesting to anyone else, but it was very fun to have. Super.